Hey there! Welcome to this week's message from Centralia Christian Church. We are so glad that you are listening, and we hope this message will encourage and inspire you to walk closer with Jesus. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into the Word together.
All right, so this is our final week of a series called Unlikely. And if you remember, our definition for unlikely is not likely, improbable, likely to fail, or unpromising. And over the last couple of weeks, we've met our main characters for this series. We've met the Midianites. They're distant relatives of Israel who were raiding Israel for 7 years. We finally saw them soundly defeated last week. But there is a correction that I do need to make, and that is that last week I told you that 120,000 Midianites fell in the battle last week. That's technically not accurate. Technically, there is another battle, one we'll actually see this week, and it was between those two battles that 120,000 men died. How many in each one? I don't know. But total, it was spread out over two battles, not the one. We also saw Gideon. He was introduced in week 1, called by an angel as a mighty warrior. He spent most of his time hiding or testing God. He's tested God 4 different times during this series. And he finally leads Israel to battle, and God intervenes and wins that battle for them. And now he is pursuing what is left of the Midianite army. And so in week 1, we saw how God can use unlikely people and how God loves to take unqualified people to do these crazy things for him. And that it doesn't really matter if we're unqualified or not to do what God asks us to do. When God asks us to do something, we do need to do it. We have to act. Last week, we saw how God can use unlikely circumstances. And we saw how God created this impossible situation and then just completely just basically showed off. And sometimes in our lives, these unlikely circumstances, they can end really well. Sometimes they don't end well, though. But God can still use them all the same, even if it's sometimes harder for us to see how he works. So this week, we're talking about endings. We're talking about how God can use unlikely endings. So if you look up endings in the dictionary, you will find this: an end or final part of something, especially a period of time or an activity. And the reason why I really wanted to point this out is because when you think of endings, we often think of, like the final part, so like the end of our lives. But I just wanted to point out, I'm not saying that you have to wait until the end of your life to see how God uses things. And we'll get to that in the end. But there's different things we go through in our lives that could be considered endings. And so when I was getting ready for the sermon, I thought it'd be cool to figure out maybe some movie endings or book endings that just have these unlikely, crazy endings. But I couldn't figure any out. I mean, personally, my all-time favorite movie or book ending is Lord of the Rings, but, it was really hard to find these for the sermon. So I was like, well, we should just look at Bible stories. It's probably the best thing to do anyway. But did you know there are a lot of Bible stories with unlikely endings? And they're easy to miss if you just get in the mode of just reading the Bible and, I've read this story 100 times before. I know how it's going to end. It's not unexpected at all. But if you look at these stories like, I've never seen these stories before, there are some crazy, weird endings to stories in the Bible. For example, if you look in 2 Kings 6, there's this group of prophets that's building basically a new town for them to live in. And while they're chopping down trees, this axe head falls off, and it falls into the water. Now, axe heads do not float, they sink. It tends to be a desired quality in an axe head, making it harder than the wood. But it falls into the water and it sinks. And Elisha, the prophet, comes over, throws a stick in the water, and the axe head floats to the surface. Isn't that crazy? Or if you look what about Jonah? Jonah is a prophet sent to tell the city of Nineveh to repent. And he doesn't want to go because he doesn't like the people of that city. But after an unexpected fish trip, he finally agrees to go. But he expects the city to be destroyed. But the people repent. The city isn't destroyed, and Jonah gets mad at God because of it. And the book of Jonah ends with a question, with God asking Jonah a question. There's no answer, just a question. Interesting way to end a story. What about Absalom? So Absalom was one of the sons of King David. And he decided he'd rather be king than his dad, so he turns on his dad, chases him out of Jerusalem, and then keeps chasing him. But in 2 Samuel 14, we are told that Absalom would grow out his hair each year and then cut it off. And every time he cut his hair, he would weigh it. And it would weigh 6 pounds. Now, 6 pounds doesn't seem like a lot, but I challenge you to go home and get 6 pounds and stick it to your head and walk around for a while. So he's got 6-pound hair, and he's riding through the forest, chasing after David's army, and his hair gets caught in a tree. And his horse, mule, donkey, whatever he was riding, kept going, and he was left hanging in a tree by his hair until Joab comes and kills him. Like, you think about all of the villain stories in movies or books, how many of them end with someone getting stuck in a tree by their hair? It's crazy. What about in 2 Kings 2? Elisha is taunted. He's made fun of by some boys. I can't remember where he was going, but they were saying things like, "Go on up, you bald head." And he called down a curse upon them, and you guys know what happened? A bear comes charging out of the woods and mauls 42 of them. That's crazy. Or in Numbers 16, there's this guy named Korah. He led this rebellion against Moses, decided he maybe would be a better leader. Maybe he'd take him back to Israel and get him out of trouble. And the story ends with Israel backing away from Korah. I think there were 1 or 2 other leaders and their families, and the ground literally swallowed them up. I've never seen that before. That's pretty crazy. What about in Genesis 5? It says Enoch lived like 300 years or something like that, and then he walked with God and was no more. Doesn't seem that spectacular, but that's one of the craziest endings to someone's story there is. Or in 2 Kings 2, you have the prophet Elijah is taken up to heaven in a chariot. And his protege or successor, Elisha, was watching. But when Elisha comes back and tells everybody what happened, no one believed him. No one believed that Elijah had gone to heaven. And so they sent out 50 men for 3 days to try and find this dude that was no longer around. And then finally admitted defeat and said, "Elisha, you might be right. He might be gone." Like, it's crazy. Or if you look at Acts 14, Paul is preaching in a city, and he makes some people, specifically the Jews, mad, and they drag him outside the city and stone him. And when you get stoned in the Bible, you get these giant chunks of rock hurled at you until you die. It's not something you live through. But everybody goes back in the city, and then Paul stands up and walks right back into the city. That's crazy. And there's many other stories like this in the Bible, but sometimes we just get used to reading and we're like, well, I knew that was going to happen. It's not that surprising. But then if you look at it like, if I've never read this story before, this is crazy. And so today, we're going to finally wrap up our story of Gideon. And the story has an unlikely ending, not really because it's necessarily absolutely crazy, because it's really, really, really confusing. This was hard for me to put together and figure out what I was going to do this week. So we're going to pick up at the end of Judges 7, starting in verse 24. And then we're going to finish out our story of Gideon today. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. But he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. So here we have the Ephraimites, which are another tribe of Israel, join the battle. They weren't initially called out, but they killed 2 princes, Oreb and Zeb. This is kind of a side note, but they named the places where they killed these guys the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. Those are really weird names for places, aren't they? Well, if you look at what their names actually mean, again, this is just kind of an interesting little side note, you'd see that Oreb means raven and Zeb meant wolf. And they're common tribal names for people. So instead of reading it the rock of Oreb, it would technically be the rock of the raven and the winepress of the wolf. Those are a little bit cooler names. I'm not sure what a wolf is doing with grapes, but you know. So it says that they were Midianite princes, and this is literally a leader or a chieftain, possibly a military leader. These guys probably aren't the sons of the kings of Midian, but they're very important, at least to the military. So the Ephraimites do all this. They come back, and then they get mad at Gideon. And they say, "Why didn't you call us out sooner? Why did you leave us out? What are you doing?" It says they contended vigorously over this. And maybe a couple reasons for this. One is maybe the Ephraimites felt cheated out of some of the spoils, you know. The longer you're in the battle, I guess, the more money, the more spoils you get. So it might have been, "Gideon, why didn't you call us out sooner? We could have made more money off of this." Or maybe they were defending their honor. In Judges 5, which Deborah, who's actually the last judge before Gideon in this book, curses all of the tribes of Israel who didn't fight for Israel. Now, Ephraim was a part of that battle. They did fight, but they might be a little afraid of that because they probably were there. They probably heard that. Might be thinking, "Gideon, we were here. We would have fought. We're not weak. We didn't hide. We're here. You just didn't call us." And whatever the case, Gideon calms them down quickly, says, "Hey, you've done so much more than I have. Why are you mad?" And it says that their anger subsided, or it literally grew slack. And, you know, I do a lot of fishing, but I picture like fishing line, the moment you lose that fish and the line just slacks. That's what I think of. Anyway. So ironically, Gideon is about to do way more than the Ephraimites have done. But this is where the story gets very, very confusing. See, I don't really know how to explain what's about to happen in this story. It's almost like Gideon becomes bipolar toward God. I don't know. He basically, one minute he's serving God, the next he's serving himself, then he's serving God again, no, he's serving himself again. He just kind of goes back and forth for the rest of the story. So we'll pick up in Judges 8 in verse 4. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" Then Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." Gideon, we have here picking up the pursuit of Midian. Whether this is 300 men or the rest of the men that got called back, we aren't sure. But it says they're exhausted. They attacked in the middle of the night, and they've been pursuing ever since. And so they stopped to seek help from two different cities. And the first one is Succoth, which is, depending upon your translation, spelled with two K's or two C's. And it literally means thicket or refuge. Gideon asks for bread. They say no. And it kind of looks like, based on the way they answer, that Succoth is kind of in this self-preservation mode. Kind of Gideon, you haven't won this battle yet. Zeba and Zalmunna aren't dead, and we're kind of scared of them, so we're not going to help until somebody wins, because we don't want to be in trouble. And Gideon promises to return and punish them with desert thorns and briars. So they go to Peniel, or Penuel, based whatever your translation is, and it literally means face of God, and they respond the exact same way. Gideon, you haven't won yet, so we're not going to do anything until somebody wins. And Gideon promises to come back and tear down their tower. But apparently that didn't deter him, because he kept chasing Midian. Now Zeba and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zeba and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them. But he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are Zeba and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?'" He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. Then he asked Zeba and Zalmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "Men like you," they answered, "each one with the bearing of a prince." Gideon replied, "Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and afraid. Zeba and Zalmunna said, "Come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. And here Gideon catches up to the remaining Midianite army. We're told it's 15,000 men, and 120,000 have fallen so far. Whatever Gideon's force is, they rout them easily, and Zeba and Zalmunna are captured. And then Gideon returns to Succoth and Peniel to exact something from them. He takes the time to learn all 77 names of the elders of Succoth, and then punishes all of them with desert thorns and briars to correct their taunting of him earlier, that they weren't sure he would succeed in defeating Midian. Then he turns to Peniel, and he tears down the tower there and kills every male in the city. So why did Gideon do all of this? This is the part of the story that's kind of confusing. I mean, we have Gideon's chasing Midian, as he is supposed to be. He asks for help, which I don't think God ever told him, stop at these cities and ask for help. But these cities say no. And then he promises to come back and punish them for saying no. So unless I am missing something, please tell me if I am, but it seems like this is all about personal vengeance. All about, you are taunting me, you're not going to help me, I'm going to deal with that. So this is first where it seems Gideon is serving himself here Now again, I could be wrong. And then he turns to Zeba and Zalmunna and starts questioning them about some men they had killed. And it seems that likely that he probably already knew that they had killed his brothers. But only after questioning them does he apparently decide to kill them and said, "If you had let my brothers live, I wouldn't kill you." So Gideon tries to have his son Jether kill them. And all it says is Jether is a boy. We don't know how old he is. He must have been fairly young. If someone is killed by somebody who is not an adult, that is an insult. And so Gideon could be trying to insult the kings by having them killed by a boy, or it's a lesson in family loyalty to his son. Hey, they killed your uncles, go take care of them. Either way, Jether says no. And the Midianite kings taunt Gideon. Gideon doesn't do so well with taunting, by the way. He tends to react violently. And they taunt him and say, "Do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." It's either, "Gideon, we don't think you can kill us," or, "Gideon, we'd rather die by your hand, so we're going to taunt you a little bit and get you to take us out." Gideon immediately steps forward and kills them and took the ornaments from their camels' necks, possibly the signs that they were kings. So, yes, but the story gets more confusing after that. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on the camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace 40 years. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than Israel again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done for them. And that is finally how the story of Gideon ends. The men of Israel ask Gideon to rule over them. They say, "You, your son, and your grandson rule over us." And this was a demand. It wasn't a request. It was, "Gideon, you need to do this. Come do it." But Gideon refuses. He says, "No, I won't be your king. I'm not going to rule over you, nor will my son." Ironically, not true. "The Lord shall rule over you." But for insisting that the Lord shall rule over you, there's some things pretty inconsistent happening in this passage, in all of this story. Israel not so much needed a king, but they needed someone to lead them, to keep them close to God. And it doesn't really even look like Gideon did that. Maybe he did. This just says Gideon goes home and grows his family and has 70 kids. I mean, why would you have 70 kids? Anyway, throughout this story, he was chosen by God to lead, at least to defeat Midian. Spent a lot of his time doubting. When Gideon is questioning the kings of Midian, they describe his brothers and get anything, but Gideon doesn't really respond to that, but he was kind of more focused on killing them. Gideon's family, again, this doesn't really mean much, but his family was at least the size of a royal family. I'm not even sure some royal families had 70 kids, but again, doesn't necessarily mean much. And finally, Gideon's son with his concubine is named Abimelech. And if you go on reading after Judges 8, you'll see Abimelech was not very nice at all. But what's interesting is that the name Abimelech literally means, my father is king. So, I mean, maybe it's meant to refer to God, but it sure is interesting to reject being king of Israel and then name your son, my dad is king. It's kind of inconsistent. And then Gideon says, God will rule over you, but wait, give me one of each of your earrings from this plunder. And he turns it into a golden ephod and places it in Ophrah, and it becomes an idol to everyone, including Gideon. Now, an ephod is a priestly garment that was fairly, at the time at least, expensive. It was made of things like gold and blue and purple and scarlet cloth and fine linen. And the gold would have been kind of woven into this chain pattern. And they would be worn for ceremonies, and for every sacrificial rite that happened, the priest, or at least the high priest, would have to wear this ephod. But Gideon makes himself a gold copy and places it in his hometown. And it could be he realized that what he'd done earlier had gone too far, and he was trying to atone for this. Probably not. It could be he's trying to credit God for the victory that God had given them over Midian, which, good thing to do. Making a golden ephod, maybe not the best way to do that. Or maybe he just wanted to use it to inquire of God later about different things. We're not really sure why Gideon made this, but what we do know is that it was a huge problem. It says Israel prostituted themselves before it, which literally means adultery, apostasy. Could literally say Israel cheated on God with a golden ephod. It's kind of a side note, but this came up in small group earlier in the week. But how many times do we look at sin as cheating on God? Just throwing that out there. So this idol became a trap to Gideon and to his family. It's kind of funny, the very person who removed idol worship, at least from Ophrah, in the beginning of the story, is the person who brought it back. It's the person who said, God will rule over you, but then makes something that turns everybody's hearts away from God. Then the story finishes saying, during Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. And even though God had accomplished this great victory, after Gideon dies, it says, as soon as Gideon died, Israel turned to the Baals. Or I think some places, some versions, it might say immediately. This is the only place in the entire book of Judges, after a judge has led and dies, that it says, as soon as this person died, Israel turned away. Everywhere else says, again, Israel turned away from God, or again, Israel followed other gods. Again, Israel did wrong. This is the only place that says, as soon as and immediately after Gideon died, Israel turned away. How is it that such an incredible story, where everything that's happened, it could only be God, there is no other possibility, how could that story end so badly? Where as soon as Gideon dies, they turn away from God and they forget everything God has done. That's crazy. This is a life-changing story, but as soon as Gideon dies, nobody remembers what happened. When we're talking about God using unlikely endings today. So how can God use this unlikely ending? If you look at the other judges in the book of Judges and the effects of their influence, we see some interesting things happening. Othniel, it says he saved Israel. The land had peace for 40 years. Ehud, every teenage boy's favorite judge story, describing the gruesome end of the king of Moab. The land had peace for 80 years. Shamgar saved Israel. Deborah and Barak, the land had peace for 40 years. But then starting with Gideon, there's this interesting thing that happens. You start seeing a noticeable increase in judges sticking around to rule or styling themselves like kings. After Gideon, we have Tola. It says he led Israel 23 years. There's no mention of a conflict. Maybe there was. Maybe there's a perfectly good reason for this. Then you have Jair, who led Israel for 32 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. Now, I personally have never aspired to own 30 donkeys, but it was a sign of wealth. So not only did he lead, he was wealthy, and again, no conflict is mentioned. Then we have Jephthah, who only agreed to help to be a judge for this if his half-brothers would agree to let him rule Gilead after. It says he led Israel 6 years. You have Ibzan, who led Israel 7 years. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters. Again, why would you have 60 kids? I mean, seriously. Then you have Elon, who led Israel 12 years. Again, no conflict mentioned. Abdon led Israel 8 years, had 40 sons. Again, why? And 30 grandsons. And finally, Samson, who led Israel 22 years, but was never really that interested in leading. And so throughout Judges, we see that God uses people, normal human people, as his agents to bring about salvation. But most of the obstacles they had to face were so impossible that they would have had to be defeated by God. Throughout all of the book of Judges, all of the different things they face, the only explanation is that God was helping them. And so we see this pattern in Judges. This pattern is that Israel is searching for a king. They're trying to find another source of leadership, mostly because they don't want to follow God, but they are looking for a king, someone to rule over them. In 1 Samuel, which comes not long after Judges, Israel asks Samuel to appoint a king to lead them. Samuel was kind of getting to the end of his life, and as well as all of Israel, Samuel realized that his sons were not fit to lead. And so Israel said, "Appoint us a king. We need a leader." And Samuel is he's horrified by this. He goes to God, he says, "God, what are they doing?" And God says, "Samuel, this isn't about you. They're not rejecting you. This is them rejecting me." So he gives them a king. And in Deuteronomy 17, Moses even predicts that Israel will ask for a king. Before they've even gone into the promised land, he says, this will happen. And these are the things the king is going to do. These are the things you will not want to see, but the king will do this. And this is what's going to happen. But you will ask for a king. You will turn from God. And so, throughout all of Judges, they're searching for a king. It kind of hit me as I was studying for today during this week. Now, there's a lot of different things we could say is the main point of the Bible, right? But it hit me this week that the Bible is about God as king. It's really about God's kingship, his ultimate authority in everything. And our inability to accept it, our struggle to submit to this. And we saw Adam and Eve turn away from God and disobey him in the garden. But eventually, through his son Jesus, God issues this gracious invitation for everyone to come back into his kingdom, to submit to him as king through the atoning death and resurrection of his son Jesus. And there's this theme all throughout the Bible of God is king. And so Gideon, whether you want to describe him as inconsistent or at times a coward or whatever, the ending of his story kind of feels hopeless because God does all of these amazing things only for Israel to forget and turn away. And if you fast forward to the end of the book of Judges, in Judges 21, the book ends, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." But if you put this in the perspective of Israel has completely rejected God as their king, then saying Israel had no king is much, much worse than simply there was no physical leader, because they have completely rejected and turned away from God. But God still uses this. His plan keeps moving forward. And in the end, we will see, as we saw not that long ago with Easter, we see God's plan come to fruition as Jesus pays for our sin. The invitation to submit to God, to re-enter his kingdom, is issued. And also the book of Judges illustrates why we desperately need God's rule, not our own rule. And attempts otherwise lead to chaos. So, what does all of this mean for us? At the end of the day, no matter what happens, means that God is king, and we are not. God is the one in charge of everything. No matter how crazy our day was, no matter how crazy anything gets, God is king. That doesn't change. And attempts to usurp that position, as basically the entire history of Israel shows, those attempts do not end well. Because God is king and he is supposed to be king, not us. It also means that God can use our own unlikely endings to reaffirm his kingship or even his plan. I pointed out earlier, when I talk about endings, I'm not just saying the end of our life, but that there are other endings that we go through. I was going to have a list of examples prepared for you, but then I realized, there are some stories about endings that were used by God that maybe we should just talk about those. It's kind of funny. Before first service, I was talking with one of the older ladies. Her name's Dee, if you know her. And she said the phrase, "It is well with my soul." I just kind of laughed a little bit, because one of the people I wanted to mention today was Horatio Spafford, who wrote the hymn, "It is well with my soul." During his life, he lost one child to disease. He lost his remaining 4 daughters in a shipwreck that only his wife and his family survived. He was supposed to be on that ship, but he was delayed by work. He and his wife had 3 more kids, and they lost another one to sickness. If you're counting, that is 6 children that he lost. But he ended up serving God faithfully, if I remember right, in Jerusalem after all of that happened. It's fairly certain that all of losing every one of those kids, especially in that shipwreck, could have been endings. Many people might have walked away from God, but they shaped Horatio Spafford into a faithful servant who kept serving God. Or what about John Newton? He's the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. He was a slave trader, or he was a captain of a slave ship. One day his ship was sinking, and after spending years of running from God, years of defying God, he cries out to God for help. God saves him, he turns his life around, and he serves God faithfully for the rest of his life because of that unlikely ending on a sinking slave ship. I didn't actually know this one before, but Joseph Scriven, or however you pronounce that last name, he is the original author of the hymn, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Now, if I remember right, it was written in a different language and had to be translated and edited a little bit. But Joseph Scriven, on 2 separate occasions, was engaged to be married to somebody. And about a week before the wedding, his fiancée died. Twice. 2 separate occasions. And it wasn't like, he offed them or anything like that. It was like, I think one of them might have died on a horse, like falling off a horse or something like that. Like, just crazy things. Just a week before the wedding. And after that, he writes this song because he realized, even after going through this, he had an even greater assurance that God was with him. Or if you turn to the Bible, think about Paul on the road to Damascus. Paul got his start killing Christians. He held the coats for the people who stoned Stephen to death. He was headed to Damascus to kill more Christians, to capture more. And he encounters God in a way really no one else has ever encountered God in that way. And his life becomes all about bringing people to Christ, not killing them anymore. Unlikely endings that God uses. But for us, maybe it's losing a job. Maybe it's moving, going to college, watching your kids go to college. Maybe it's ending up in a career you never imagined you'd end up in. Maybe it's something really, really good. Maybe it's something that's not so good. But either way, God is still completely in control of everything. And his plan, it will succeed. But speaking of endings, I thought there'd be no better way to finish today than to read out of Revelations 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and he will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." And that ending keeps going. But no matter what we go through in our lives, no matter what we face, if we are Christians, if we have submitted to God as our King, then that is what we have to look forward to. Something that, as humans right now, we probably can't even completely grasp how amazing this will be. It's not sitting on a cloud playing a harp. It's everything that we have known, all of our pain, our sorrow.
We would like to thank you for spending part of your day here with us. Our mission here at Centralia Christian Church is to help people build full-time relationships with Jesus. If you would like more info on the ministry or giving opportunities, visit us online at www.centraliachristian.org.